Hi, everybody. So I'm Claire Durand. I'm a former president of WAPOR. I will animate, I will take care of this webinar today. Now, the webinar is about, as you know, mixed mode sampling for public opinion research, much more than a plan B. And it is in our webinar series. I want to remind you that recording and slides for all our webinars will be at WAPOR resource WAPOR webinars, so you can go and get them there. And I remind you also before starting that the next webinar will be on May 25, and it will be by Florian Kirsch from University of Mannheim, Germany, on data collection with wearables, apps, and sensors. This webinar is sponsored by the World Association for Public Opinion Research as part of its mission to promote international cooperation and exchange among academic and commercial researchers, journalists, and political actors. So we invite you to visit our website and consider becoming a member, since all this is free of charge for everybody. I will now introduce Sébastien Dallaire, who is Senior Vice President, Public Affairs for Ipsos Canada. Sébastien has been involved in political polling for more than 20 years, during which he has developed in-depth expertise in measuring public opinion via live interviewer phone sampling, opt-in, online panels, mail-in surveys, mixed mode sampling. He's a leading spokesperson and political analyst for Ipsos in Canada. So I will now leave Sébastien start his presentation. And after that, you will be able to either ask questions in the chat or raise your hand and ask questions verbally. So Sébastien, you can start now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire, for this nice introduction. The presentation should be on now. Can everybody see okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you for this introduction. As Claire says, I've been doing this for many years now. A lot of gray hair, not as much left as there used to be. And it's really a pleasure to talk to you about this morning. And before we started, I just thought that I would talk about why the subtitle much more than a plan B. Because over the years, as we started doing this, we've heard sometimes people tell us, well, it's a plan B because your plan A maybe doesn't work as well. So you're just trying to maybe absorb the weaker elements of other methods. And the reality is much more complex than that. And we feel that more and more, looking in the future, mixed mode sampling or mixed mode data collection or a variety of methods will be involved in public opinion research. And so to give you a sense of what I'll be talking about for the next hour or so, we'll be talking about, well, at Ipsos, how do we approach political polling? Because it's important to understand our mindset. When do we choose single mode versus mixed mode? Are there set and fast rules that we can follow? What are the core challenges of mixed mode polling? And in that section, yes, I will focus on the challenges and applying it and the theory behind it. That it's not that simple, but also about aspects that sometimes we see as practitioners but may not be visible depending on your standpoint. If you're doing academic research and you're asking for a polling company to do research for you, sometimes those practical aspects are invisible, and they are very important. There are a lot of logistical, operational challenges associated with this that are important to talk about. And fourth point, I'll talk briefly about a new approach that Ipsos have been trying. Well, it's not entirely new. The knowledge panel has existed for over 20 years, used to be called a knowledge network. Some of you might know it under that name. Ipsos purchased it a few years ago, and so now Ipsos runs the knowledge panel. It's been around for a long time in the US, now in the UK, and we're rolling it out in many European countries as well now. And it's a different approach to mixed mode research, and I'll talk about this briefly, and then I'll talk about, in the end, just in conclusion, there's an art and there's a science of polling, and we have to try to find the right balance. Of course, we want science, we want set rules to follow, we want to be able to have a sound scientific method, but we cannot fully remove the art from it either. So political polling at Ipsos, we believe electoral polling is a very important activity, as I'm sure most of you on the call are. You are members of WAPOR, and you're attending this presentation. It's part of the electoral process. It's relevant information that members of the general public will use as part of their overall information toolkit to understand what's happening during the year or during an election campaign. If it's well done and it's well communicated and it's done transparently, it is good for democracy. Of course, that is if it's well done, well documented, and the results are as accurate as they can be. And that's very important. If you don't have those conditions, then the effects on democracy are not so positive, obviously. But for several reasons, and I don't want this presentation to be about all those reasons. A lot has been said about those various reasons, but it's becoming much harder to do accurate polling, and it's something that we have to be honest and transparent about. So the political environment has become more volatile. In previous generations, sometimes, as here in Canada and in Quebec, you'd say, you're a true blue, or you're red to the core, and you've been blue your entire life. You will remain blue. Often members of the same households would also be the same color for their entire lives. And this is not the case anymore. You see a lot more switching and moving around, and it's been a particular challenge here very locally in the province of Quebec in Canada, where we've had massive swings in electoral polls over the past few elections, especially for federal level elections. And it's becoming harder to capture those rapid changes in public opinion. You combine this with the fact that it's harder to reach all your perfectly representative samples. Some audiences are harder to reach sometimes because of social and political division. A lot has been written over the challenges that we've faced as an industry in the US, for example, in the Trump era, where deep political division and the fact that polling itself has become politicized, there's just a portion of the electorate that is extremely hard to reach and to talk to. And if you do talk to them, will they tell you the truth? So a lot of challenges on that front. And if you've never read WAPOR's report on the 2016 election and what had happened, it's fascinating to see all of those little factors, how they came into play. And of course, you have the constantly changing telecommunications landscape, which means that, especially for younger generations, the way they interact with their environment, the way you can contact them constantly changes. And they are also solicited from so many fronts at once that they are not as likely to answer surveys, and they're hard to reach, and more because of spam and many different other communications challenges, and I would say competition. It's also a question of credibility. How do you convince people to take part in surveys? So many challenges. So even with the best methods and teams, there's a level of uncertainty and risk of errors. It was there in the past. It's just that it's been amplified by everything that I just mentioned. But nonetheless, we strive to have the maximum level of rigor and based on global expertise. And that's why for us, polling is not just I would say it's not just a local activity, but it's something that we do as a team globally. So we do have a global head of election research. His name is Oliviero Marchese, and some of you have probably seen him give talks before. So he's responsible for working with countries on forward planning and electoral projects, monitoring what's happening, and also after an election is over, it's great to have a person we can talk to at the local level, at the global, sorry, for us at the local level, to be able to bounce ideas and say, what have we learned in other elections that maybe can help us here? Is there something that we have missed that maybe you've seen happen in France or in the UK or in the Netherlands? And it's very important for us to have that resource. So for us, it's a continuous learning process. It's not event-driven. Our aim is to build knowledge and expertise across the company, across countries. So it really is an ongoing learning process. It's a challenging one, but it's obviously an exciting one. So is it single mode or when do we pick single mode or mixed mode? Everything I just said about Ipsos makes it so that we like to call ourselves mode agnostic. And like, we don't look at political polling as having to be done using one data collection method over all others. If you're a polling company that only operates in one country in one region, and there's one approach that has worked best for you for years and that you've invested a lot of money in, you may tend to stick to that one and try to fix it, as opposed to look at other options because it's harder, it involves more investments. We don't bother with those restrictions because our goal is just to be the best we can around the world. So we don't have a vested interest in sticking with one method over others. What we want is to try to be as precise as possible. And so it's really what drives our choice of data collection and sampling methods are really what type of questions are we going to be using. Sometimes it's better if it's self-administered, sometimes it's better if it's read to the person. What type of sample size and what's your target population? All of these will have a lot more say in how we collect the data, how we approach the research, than starting with a data collection method. So we do have a general POV on this that you can find. You see the picture and the website here, so you can find more information on this on our website or a view of this. And so it's about starting from the research need, and the approach will be tailored to what we need, and that means it's also tailored to each country. I'll talk about some examples of how we use mixed methods in the past years, but this will change from one country to the next because the challenges of data collection are going to be very different for a lot of reasons. And what do we know about the potential sampling or sample coverage errors? So some biases in the sampling frame or non-response biases will be different from one country or one region to the next, and it's important to keep in mind. And what about the political environment? Does that lead to measurement error because there are some desirability effects in certain markets for various reasons? In the end, the choice between single versus mixed mode is complex. I'm talking about mixed mode today. It doesn't mean we feel it's always about mixed mode. Not necessarily. We think it's going to become more and more important because of the challenges that I've outlined earlier on. But single mode is likely to remain very important across a variety of studies for many very good reasons. And of course, if you've been a buyer of research, one would be cost, the other one would be timing. So this can have a lot of implications. But there are also a lot of topics and a lot of areas of research where single mode is just as good. And there's no reason to go into the more complex processes involved with mixed mode polling. So mixed mode is interesting in pre-election polling, trying to figure out voting intentions, because initially we tried to use it to deal with coverage error. So more with the sampling error, as different profiles of voters we know tend to answer questions differently. But it's not just about coverage error. It's also about measurement errors. There are some interviewer-related effects, and I'll show you a quick case study after. You'll see it could be fairly important. And so, as I mentioned before, this is evaluated on a case-by-case basis, on a country-by-country basis. And this is where the art of polling come in to play as well, because local expertise, experience matters a lot. We know what works in certain markets and what doesn't work in others. And I deal with the Canadian, the Quebec market. I have a good understanding of what's happening in other markets, but I certainly cannot say I'm an expert on what we do in other markets, because I'm not at all. So nevertheless, you know, we feel that the proactive use of mixed mode can really help research address the trade-offs between the mixed modes, because the more we do it, the more we build a basic understanding. We learn about the best practices. We learn about what works well in certain countries, not in others, and we can develop a stronger scientific-based approach to fixing issues related to representativeness, measurement, validity, consistency, speed, cost, or ways to find efficiencies. So in theory, so don't worry about all the different cells, but just to show you, so you have on top face-to-face on the left, telephone in the middle, online on the right. And for each of those, you try to build what we would call a cell-oriented sample design, where you're trying to, in this case, we've put, you know, gender, the typical gender by age, quotas or stratification guidelines. So you have younger generations, and within each generation, you try to have a good gender balance to make sure that your sample is sound. And then you have also what we call the social grades. You could include a variety of demographic variables in here, but A, B, C, D, and E, you're trying to have so good gender and age balance, but also included education levels, regional splits, other key variables that are important in different markets, to make sure that you have the best sample mix possible. And when I talked about sample coverage challenges, it means that it's possible that you do face-to-face, you tend to over-represent certain social grades, even if you have a good balance of gender and age within all those cells. Then you move to telephone, maybe the challenges will be slightly different. So if you only have a face-to-face sample, or only have a telephone, or only have an online sample, you create those cells to try to get correct numbers within each, but you don't really get exactly the same type of people within each cells, and they can move around. You know, it can be hard to have exactly the proper numbers in each cell. And the problem is, the more you try to fix this by imposing strict quotas, the more you obviously lose the randomness, and in some cases, the probabilistic nature of your sampling, because you're trying to pigeonhole people in different cells, which means that as you go along in your fieldwork, you kick more and more people out because once many cells are full, you're focusing on just a few. That introduces bias in your sampling because after day 2 or day 3, you are only talking to similar types of people. And of course, if the news cycle changes during those days, you can end up having a very biased sample, because if a massive crisis happens during the electoral campaign, and on days 2 and 3, you're only reaching younger people, you have no clue if older generations have been affected by that scandal. So that's why it's a very intricate, complex thing to try to get this good mix of sampling over a set period of time and make sure that you have good sound samples every day. And the idea is that if you do mixed mode research, the biases or the challenges you will face using one mode should be counterbalanced by other modes. Again, I say should, but it's because you need to understand the markets. You need to spend a lot of time researching the various possibilities to understand whether these biases will indeed tend to even out. And I'll show you examples of how that could work in a few minutes, or whether maybe you're going to make things a little worse because one is further off from what you would typically get. Obviously, what you would want ideally is that reality will be somewhere in the middle, and that your mix will allow you to reduce this sample coverage issue. In terms of measurement error, it can vary across survey modes. If you have interviewer administered surveys, obviously it's less privacy, it's not as anonymous, so you may have, depending on your topic, depending on the election, and as I talked about before, if you were talking about Trump electors in 2016, when at the time there was for some of them a reluctance to really tell someone else, oh yeah, I really like Trump. That changed over the years, but back then there was a social desirability bias, or the opposite, acquiescence. And I'll show you in a minute what he can do. For example, if you're going to talk about immigration, if you're talking to someone over the phone, it's not as easy for someone who's shy and may not have very strong view, but has negative views about immigration. They speak to someone, they don't know who that person is, and they may not want to hurt their feelings by saying, you know what, I don't like immigration so much, or we have too many immigrants, or they pose a danger to our social fabric. It's something that is not as easy to say to someone over the phone as it is to say to a computer screen, where you have that confidentiality level. And as we know from social media, people behave on social media on this electronic platform very differently from the way they behave in a public setting or one-on-one if you chat with the person. That's just a reality. Then also, if you have spoken answers versus spoken questions, versus written answers that you read, and when you type an answer, these will all affect what you're going to say. If you have, for example, an open-ended question that you're going to code after the fact, well, online sometimes doesn't work as well as phone, because it doesn't allow you to say, oh, can you clarify this? Is there something else, or I'm not sure I understand this. So someone can type something that'll be very hard to read, or very short answers because they don't like typing. So it can be an additional challenge. So that's just one example. And as I mentioned before, experience, knowledge, expertise really helps understand some of those measurement biases at a local level. You build experience with this, but it always remains important to do this type of analysis continuously, because it changes over time. So So I'm giving you here an example. This was it was a publicly available piece of research, as all research that is done for the federal government in Canada. So we conducted some research where we compared phone results to online results for some questions about immigration. So we did this with the Canadian Department of Immigration, IRCC, and we asked a question that they've been tracking for years. In your opinion, do you feel that there are too many, too few, or about the right number of immigrants coming to Canada? And the red bar is a proportion of Canadians who said too many. And you see there's a 16-point gap between online and phone. So of course I picked a topic that is especially difficult in polling, and one that poses challenge of social desirability biases or acquiescence bias. But I picked that one because it's a very vivid example of the effect that it can have. Typically, you won't get those massive differences. The differences will only be a few points. But a few points, as we know, in electoral polling is a chasm. In electoral polling, you try to be within, not just within the margin of error, are ideally very, very close to the final results. So if you get this type of mode effect, that's a big problem. So that's a clear example of in this case, a social desirability effect. People talking to a live interviewer didn't dare as much to say that there were too many immigrants coming to Canada. So really big gap in this case. So what are the core challenges of mixed mode polling? So as someone who has had now quite a bit of experience using it and been talking to colleagues around the world of their experiences and being able to tap in this knowledge base, there are a lot of things we can talk about. The key challenge, and I've talked a lot about those two things in the previous slides, but I like this image of, kind of a DNA strand where we see that representation and measurement, so the two different colors. So measurement being the lighter blue, representation being the darker blue. They are intertwined the whole way through. It starts at the very beginning. What's your topic? What are your target populations? What can you do to reduce coverage error with the best sampling frame? And what do you do to have the most valid answers with the best questionnaire design? Then from then on, you look at your sampling. How do you pull your sample? What is your data collection methods? And then you move into possibilities of, measurement error, processing errors related to survey responses, the respondents themselves. And then after the fact, you look at data tabulation, edited responses, post-survey adjustments. So there's a possibility there of adjustment errors. So there are a lot of different, in many steps along the way, there are risks, and expertise, knowledge, and science really help you along the way because it cannot be an approximate process. And right now we're seeing worrying signals around the world. I've talked what we've seen in the US because that's been the most publicly discussed one. But if you're indeed, for those of you who are in the UK, of course, Brexit was also a big challenge. But we can pull out many other examples of where, despite the fact that generally speaking, polls remain very accurate overall, and I can say this with confidence because I know Professor Durand has done great research on this, where she shows that polling remains accurate. But I can tell you that from a pollster's perspective, that also requires a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time to get to that point. And yet we still do miss once in a while, and we have to try to refine the approaches. But one of the things that as a pollster is scary, is the second bullet, because it's not always visible. You can stratify your sample as much as you want. You can have many control criteria involved, regional splits, rural, urban, social demos, and mention age by gender. There are many different ways to try to make your sample as representative as possible through these quotas, through this stratification. Unfortunately, sometimes the sample looks great. It still doesn't give you the results you need. And I know in my case, it happened in 2018 in Quebec with the Quebec provincial election in Canada, where the results were not close to the final results. Pollsters, all pollsters had correctly picked the winner, but the margin of victory was much wider than expected. And in that case, post ex facto research on our sampling that was conducted by Claire Durand and André Blais here in Quebec showed that, in fact, the sampling was not the issue. Something else had happened, and something had happened in the last few days of the campaign, which is, in effect, quite rare. Often it's kind of a reason that given, well, things must have changed over the last few days, which is obviously a possibility. And it's a growing one because people make up their minds later. Generally speaking, you don't see a lot of those last minute changes. But the whole point here is that it's not necessarily visible. And that makes it scary because you can think everything is good, but you're not sure. And it's especially complicated for subnational representation. If you go into more localized sampling, then it's even more complicated. And often we're told, well, just use RDD, CADI, and it's going to be better because we know panels don't have enough people if you focus on a mid-sized city or anything else that's kind of very localized. But it's not that simple anymore because you don't have a vast majority of people on landlines that you can really geo-target as well as you used to, because you have to account for the fact that the majority of households now have cell phones, and cell phones cannot be pinpointed with the same level of accuracy, and it changes from one country to the next. But generally speaking, the captation areas for cell phone numbers is going to be much broader, which is, I know personally, I haven't done like riding polls in many, many years because, and riding, sorry, for those of you in different countries, but an electoral district poll in countries where you have electoral districts that are fairly limited, small geographically, and you have a first past the post system, it's important to try to understand who among the different party candidates in this very specific riding has a better chance of winning. And because of the massive challenges in trying to target the population properly within that riding, we've stayed away from it because it's, in order to do it properly, it would be prohibitively expensive for clients who really want to understand this. And it's extremely complicated. So we've kind of stayed away from it in general. So mixed mode seems to increasingly emerge as a good option for many of those challenges, but it's difficult to implement. And I'll talk about one of those, which is, how do you calibrate the share of each data collection mode? What kind of benchmarks can be used to evaluate the representation of the mixed mode solution in the end? These are not simple. There's limited knowledge on this because it hasn't been done for many, many years. It's a fairly new approach. I mean, not very new, but still, it takes time. Elections are not that frequent in various countries, so it takes time to build that knowledge base. Our Serbian team has explored using that's a bad lapsus, generalized reduced gradient method to optimize a sample blend. So of course, I'm not going to go into the whole non-linear equation explanation because I will trip over it. and it's really our data science people who have developed that approach. But it allows us to have a kind of a more formalized approach to the sample blend calibration. And I'll explain in the next couple of slides how you can apply it and what it looks like. And it's something that we will evaluate across countries over time to see, is that a way to have a more coherent and standardized approach to sampling blend as we move forward. And so our global science organization is evaluating and looking at ways to improve those procedures. And the goal is really to introduce more science on top of the local expertise and experience that we have, and take into account all the possibilities of things that can affect sample quality, sample design. And so the idea is to define what we call this two-step procedure. One is you could do the weighting within each mode and then compute an optimal weight between modes. Because the other approach that's been used often in the past is you create a global sample using the mixed modes, and I'm often talking about 2 modes, but in the future, who's to say it's not going to be 3 modes, 4 modes? We'll see how this evolves over time, but some of the approach has been that you take the whole sample and you just weight it together. It becomes this aggregated whole. But this newer approach that we are possibly looking into would be that you create a weighting approach within each mode, and then using the optimal weight that's been calculated using the GRG method, you would be able to have a more accurate sample. So I'll show you what it means. So this, and it's important, this is ex post facto. The numbers you're seeing here are numbers. We've done this after the election cycles were involved. So I'll show you first a comparison of the 2015 election and to the 2019 election, and then the 2019 election compared to the 2021 election. And in a nutshell, what we've done is we have created this weighting within each method. So online data collection was weighted as one sample. CADI data collection was weighted as another sample. Then we looked at the actual, or what we call the target, which was the actual result of the election. So if you look at the first table on top, you have online as the first column, CADI is the second one, and then the target, so the one in bold, 31.9, 39.5, 19.7. Of course, it's comma because it was built in France. So the different challenges of working on different Excel files. So you look at the difference between the 2 methods when we actually weighted them separately. The differences are quite important. And if you compare those with the target, you see that neither of them would have been very, very accurate, although CADI was closer to the results. And then in yellow, it says weight from solver, simply because solver was the name of the solver is within Excel. You can use Excel solver to help you with those calculations for the GRG approach. I'm not sure exactly how to apply it. They tell me it's fairly simple. But if looking after the fact, looking at the results of the election and looking at our 2 samples, what solver tells us is that the best weighting approach to get the most accurate results would be to give CADI a 0.72 weight versus 0.28 for online. And in reality, as you saw, the unweighted was almost the opposite. So it tells us to expand the weight of CADI, reduce the weight of online. So these are not small adjustments when looking at it in this way. And what we can do then is take those calculated weights from 2015 and see what happens when we take those weights and apply them to the next election. So in 2019, we had those online versus caddy results. And again, very similar gaps to what we saw from the previous election. Interestingly, the Liberal Party measure is pretty much just as accurate between the two modes in both elections. But you have a bigger gap for the Conservatives, in this case, the Conservative Party. And when you apply the solver weights from 2015, your results become much closer to the actual target than if you were to simply mix the two the way they used to be. So we've applied those weights, giving caddy results 0.72 and online results 0.28. Again, this is a ex post facto experience. So we didn't do this for our electoral polling. We just went and looked back at previous waves to see what would happen if we decided to do that. So that's gives us an interesting, in hindsight, gives us an interesting way of looking at this. We did the same, but this time from 2019 to 2021, exactly the same exercise, and basically results very similar again, about 0.7 to 0.3. That is the weighting that was recommended using the solver approach. And when we compare to the actual target, we do get sounder results by using this approach. Doesn't mean it will always work. Doesn't mean it will work across different countries. We don't know yet. This is really kind of, we're taking a serious look into this, and we will keep looking into this to see to what extent it helps. But that's one interesting way to look at this challenge. And what's very interesting and important here is that it does speak to the importance of mixed mode, because in the end, the results by combining the two approaches is more precise than by using only one of the two. So the theory seems to be supported in practice, and this is something we've seen across different countries where we've done this. So it's, there are some promising signs looking at this approach. And then it's important for us to evaluate sample representation beyond the usual social demos. As I mentioned, that's the scary part, when you can't really detect using the usual stratification methods, control criteria, weighting, some of the biases that can be part of your sample. And building additional points of reference is important. We have to try to find ways to make this more systematic, more scientific, in how we adjust the final results to better reflect reality. And there are new things we can do by using more sophisticated, more advanced data points. And I'll give you one example from France. L'Institut National de la Statistique en France has redefined how it categorizes some occupational status. And it's helping to, it's a new innovative way to look at some social demographic differences that really tap into some of the emerging divides in society, the structure of occupations, but it's mixed with other variables that allows us to maybe approach stratification and sampling and weighting differently. And I'm not going to show you all the various classes of employment, because it's a complex matrix, but it allows us, for example, to really differentiate between not just salaried employees and independent workers, but within those subgroups, what should we see? Highly versus less qualified, regular versus casual, public versus private, production versus service. And if we can match and use the same measures in the sample with what is measured by the national statistics, then maybe it's a way to better capture some of the social and political divisions that we see in society. And we say may, because again, that's very early very early research, but class of employment combined with a better categorization of our different territories, it opens a new perspective for what we can use as a decisive benchmark for the quality of representation in our samples, not just mixed mode sampling, but all sampling. So that's another way of looking at what can we do to make our samples better, to make our final results better. One of the things that we tend to see more on our side of all this operation are the operational challenges on a day-to-day basis from a project management side. How does using mixed mode affect your polling approach? And in this case, I'm going to do a phone and web mix because that's what we've been using for a few election cycles in Canada, but you can think of similar challenges using different mixes in approaches, whether it would be face-to-face or mail or others. There are some challenges. They apply very differently, and especially if you think of mail, it's a completely different set of challenges. And in an electoral setting, mail doesn't work too well for obvious reasons, time, and there are a lot of things are outside of your control. But the sampling itself may be a good quality, but so many other variables come into play that it's very rarely used. So phone and web example. You probably need two different operations teams, one for phone, one for online. There are very different approaches to doing a phone survey compared to an online survey. It's a very different skill set. It's a you need a different types of expertise and very simple little things like, how do you launch a data collection process using online versus web? Well, it's very different. Your kickoff meetings, you may have a kickoff meetings with two teams at once, but you also, depending on geographical reasons, time zones, whatever it is, you can have sometimes the kickoff meetings might be separate because the needs of each team will be very different. Your planning of field work and the days that you're going to be in field and planning ahead of time for the stratification of the sample is going to be very different because if you do online polling, it's not as simple as saying, well, if we need 1,000 respondents and we know that 25% of people who receive the email will answer, then we send 4,000 invitations. We should get 1,000 by tomorrow. It's not that simple because you need to stratify your sample, and you want in an electoral setting, if your field work is going to happen over 3 or 4 days over the phone, then you need to make sure that your online sample will also try to follow similar timelines. So your planning will be very different. You need to pace your mailouts. You need to prepare your mailouts ahead of time to make sure that on each given day, you have approximately the same mix of respondents. As I mentioned at the beginning of a talk when I talked about cell sampling, if you have different groups answering the survey by mail very quickly, and you fill all of your cells on day one for various subgroups, it means that starting on day 2, day 3, then you will have a very unbalanced sample. And it means that you're at risk of not measuring public opinion properly, because if something happens on day 2 in the news cycle, then everybody that answered on day 1, who are representative of only a subpopulation, won't be able to answer anymore. So you introduce a bias in your sampling. So you need to take into account the two very different ways in which the survey is administered from one day to the next. You also have work schedules. It's something that we don't need to think about, but you can't do phone calls at any time of day and night. You need to manage this. Your team will work in different time zones. Respondents may be in different time zones. In the case of Canada, it's an important issue. and work schedules for your online team as well. If you need to make adjustment, or you realize that maybe some quotas have been filling too quickly relative to other, and you need to move the pace around, when are people going to be available to do this? It may not be possible to slow things down at 1 a.m. Not that many people respond to surveys at 1 a.m., but they do. We know they do. But so planning ahead, work schedules, there are a lot of little things like this that we need to take into account. It's just a reality. You may well have two programming teams working on different programming platforms, and that poses challenges in itself. One may be a lot easier to do than the other. You have to make sure that the questionnaire formats are tailored to each platform, each need. It doesn't mean much for most people, but as a pollster and as the operational team, it makes a big difference, because your questionnaire format and the programming instructions for each question will be different. So that adds a lot of time. You're preparing your questionnaire. It's not as simple as making sure that you have your voting intentions and diagnostic questions all aligned. Obviously, most of those you already have ahead of time, but they need to be different they need to be as similar as possible, but they can't be identical depending on whether they are read to someone or shown on screen. It changes the way things will be either seen or heard. You need to think of that, and you're internally, because of the different platforms, the programming instructions. What do you do for rotations or randomization? How do you program them in? And in case of voting intentions, for example, if you do phone versus online, if you show all of the smaller third-party names on screen, you will by default tend to inflate vote for those smaller parties. So you have to take that into account as well. If you do it over the phone, which parties do you read out loud? At what point do you stop reading if you have 25 different parties? Is it entirely open-ended? Do you read just a few of them? So it poses very different challenges, and it's not exactly the same approach. So you need to be cognizant of this as you go into mixed mode polling. And so I just talked about fieldwork management differing by mode. So I've covered this. And then despite all those challenges, you want to have a balanced final sample across modes. So it's a very complex research design. It adds a lot of layers. And all of this necessitates continuous daily planning and management to make sure that you have samples that do blend together very well. And there are also other things that we need to talk about, even though they tend to be a bit more mundane, but pricing is certainly a big thing. And you do electoral polling, you tend to work with media partners. And we know, because of the changing media landscapes, budgets have changed over time, and not for the better generally. And it's much more expensive to do mixed mode than it is to do strictly online research, opt-in online, or different types of online, probabilistic online. It's going to be more expensive, but typically not as expensive as mixed mode. And if you're going to do it by phone, your questions will be different compared to it be online. Well, you have fewer questions, simpler questions. Do you go with equal samples, uneven samples? The two teams also mean that quality control time after everything is done, you really need to look at the two sampling, how they imbricate with one another. Do we have issues with one or the other? Data tabulation can be more complicated, I said, and it can be just as simple as if the software so the two different programming platform and data hosting platforms are not the same, then it requires a certain expertise to put them back together as well. So there are a lot of complexities involved, and this means that also it's not always possible for smaller firms who don't have data collection teams working in different modes, because they might be subcontracting different elements of their fieldwork. It's not something that they can do. So it's an advantage for smaller firms, obviously. And looking at all this, and I see time, so I'm pretty much almost done. It's just want to say a few words about a different kind of mixed mode, the knowledge panel. And you may have seen, if you look at our political polling in the United States, and then we've developed over the past few years many good relationships with media partners, published regularly on the state of politics in the United States. And the knowledge panel is now the approach that we use. The knowledge panel is an online panel that's recruited through probabilistic means. In the US and the UK, it's address-based sampling. There are for some specific subgroups, there could be some that are complemented via phone sampling, but generally speaking, it's an address-based sampling approach. And to make sure that we, despite the fact that it's an online panel, we connect with offline population as part of this mail-out invitation. Participants who respond and contact us via phone to say, I'd be interested, but I don't have internet access. I don't have a device to access the internet. Well, we provide them with that device. Obviously, that's an extra layer of complexity and cost, but it certainly helps us target the population in a more accurate manner and provides a different way of approaching this. So it's mixed mode in the sense that your data collection mode is not the same as your sampling mode. And this is now being rolled out in different countries around the world, and it's being looked at in many areas, and we're looking at the possibility of doing it here in Canada. And it's an approach that can provide a lot of advantages, but it's one that we're looking into, but we don't have, as I mentioned before, you need many election cycles to be able to really sharpen your understanding of how it works from especially a voting intention perspective. But all the academic research has been done with us on this over the years point to the fact that it's a very accurate tool to use to measure a lot of different social statistics. We did a lot of research on vaccine hesitancy that showed that it was an extremely accurate measurement tool compared to public health measures and national statistics. And the big advantage is that you remove the dual mode answer biases. So the measurement side of things after recruitment, you reduce this dual mode challenge of social desirability or other factors that can impact how you answer phone versus online, because everybody answers through one single mode. So we need more R&D to really understand how it works, but it's something that we think will be part of our future mix of political research. And if you go look at on our US website at our recent political polling, you will find description of how the knowledge panel has been used in the sampling for various surveys. So in the end, this, we want this to be about science, but there is an art behind it. Local in-house expertise is extremely important. I personally, yes, I do have experience with political polling in Canada. We have a vast team of experts in Canada, and I'm not, I'm certainly not going to say that I'm even the most important person in political polling in Canada. We have many people who are doing this it's what they do. It's what they do for a living, and they're great at it, but it takes years to build that expertise, to keep it, and to just constantly learn new ways of doing this. So that's very important. But we also have to think about, how do we go from the art of being a survey practitioner and to move into this more scientific, sounder way of looking at sampling and data collection. And mixed mode can be part of that framework. It can help improve sample coverage, mitigate measurement error, but a lot more needs to be done to really understand how this is going to evolve over the next few years. But considering all the challenges we face as an industry, we think that a lot more is going to be done in coming years with mixed mode around the world. So that's probably where we're heading. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Sébastien. Can you stop sharing, please? And okay, hi everybody. Just before, we already have 3 questions in. Just before going to that, just to say, as Sébastien told you, we know that there is a lot going on out there. I've just seen a text by Pew Research Center about all the different methods that are used by posters in the US. There is really lots of innovation, and WAPOR Education Committee will try to figure out what's happening and bring you, every month new viewpoints on what people use. So I get immediately to the first question. It comes from Carmen Le Foulon in France, I guess, perhaps. Many thanks for your great presentation, very clear and informative. I wanted to ask you, how do you address mode effects when combining answers to the same question collected by different methods? As you mentioned, probably very context specific. Do you first analyze whether there is measurement equivalence each time? Do you have any guidance or suggestion on that? Also wanted to ask you, do you address different selection bias by mode? At our research center, we found that telephone respondents are more interested in politics than face-to-face ones. And I would say online respondents are more interested in politics than telephone and face-to-face. Is that an issue for mixed mode? So, Sébastien.
Absolutely, it is. And it comes back to some of what I said about having a local expertise, because there's not, at least now, we don't have a general answer that we can really apply across markets, because the effects will be different in certain markets. And of course, there are more extreme differences in markets where there's a big socioeconomic gap between who is very active online versus who is not active. And that is not distributed equally from one country to the next. So it comes back to what I was saying about trying to find the right balance in what we know specifically about each market, what methods tended to be the most precise on certain questions, because the challenges of social desirability or measurement gaps, or you talked about interest gaps in depending on the methods, they're not the same across countries. They're not the same. They will vary by method. If we know locally where those differences are, where those biases are, and have they been historically fairly consistent, then we can apply correction factors nationally. And as I mentioned, what we're trying to do is build something that would allow us to have correction factors and a better sense of the proper mix to be employed across more than one country, but something that we can apply better internationally. But it is a big challenge. Absolutely. Everything you mentioned is a big challenge. And yes, we do take them into account.
Then we have a question from Michelle Ernstali. Now I know she's from Switzerland. Do you mix mode only from separate sample, or does Ipsos also mix modes sequentially or concurrently on the same sample? Like you would have one sample, you start online, you go phone, or vice versa, things that, or you know, face to face will go mode will go online, or things like that. I know that the federal government does something like that at one point.
Yeah, personally, I haven't seen the latter approach where you would complement, you start using a method and then you start mixing in other methods to complement some subgroups, but it is starting to happen. And as Claire just mentioned, we know that some governments have started doing it. There are ways to do it. And one of the things that in certain countries we looked at is if you do a national poll using an opt-in panel and certain subgroups may be underrepresented, you may complement this by using phone or using the knowledge panel to access offline populations and get and have a stronger mix at the end. But as far as maybe it's been done in certain countries, but I know in Canada we have never done this in the context of public opinion polling, political polling per se. I don't think we've ever done that. At least I have not seen it.
Okay. Yeah, I know that this is one of the things that is happening also. I have a follow-up question from Carmen Le Foulon, who's in fact Chilean with a French name. She asked if your answer implies that there will be some questions that you cannot approach by mixed mode. In your view, are there questions that you cannot approach by mixed mode?
I don't think that it's a question that you cannot approach, but when you approach them, you need to know that there will be possibly a stronger mode effect, and that's important. And I gave the example of whether we should let in more or the same amount or fewer immigrants, because that's probably the one where you would have the strongest mode effect. So in that case, maybe you would approach this differently. Is it we know instinctively that it probably means the online answer is more accurate, because logically, if we think about this, if you do have this answer, it certainly does fit with the idea that there's a social desirability bias. So in a case like this, you would probably approach the weighting needs very differently, whether you're doing this online or by phone, or it really depends on what the mix is. If the entire study, I would say if the entire study were to be about immigration in that case, then maybe the answer is, in that case, online only would be the best approach, because that's probably where you would get the best read. But if immigration is only one component of your research, and the research involves many other questions where you do need mixed mode to get the best representation possible, that would be an interesting challenge. How do you really deal with the few questions on immigration where you might have a stronger mode effect? And that's, I don't think I have a really solid answer on that one. I would need to think about it.
Thanks, Sebastian. There is a question by Jesus Rios, but it comes, I think it comes to the same first question from Carmen that you answered. I have a question for you. I know, you know, that in the US and in Canada, you do not only mix mode, you also mix sample providers. So for one mode, like online, you have, for example, 3 sample provider, yourself and others. What is the idea of this, and how does it affect your estimates? You think you see differences between different online panel opt-in panels?
Well, the goal is to try to work with providers that we know will follow similar quality guidelines. Then we will also apply to our own panel. Of course, if you don't go through those quality checks, you work with all suppliers without paying attention to this, then yes, you could certainly see varying qualities and then quality levels, and then we've seen a lot of research done on that results can vary by panel. So we try to be very diligent with whom we work with, and the reason why we do this is simply because the volume of research that a company like Ipsos and major providers will do on an annual basis or on a monthly basis or a weekly basis make it so that to only work with your own panel, especially when you need, and I mentioned sub-regional samples before, you having just one general sample of 1,000 nationally, then yes, you can work easily within the confines of your own panel. But even if you have a panel that is very big, if you do on a daily basis many surveys where you need good sub-regional samples as well, one sample is not, one panel will not be sufficient to do all of this without talking to the same people too often, without having some sampling issues related to the frequency, and in certain regions you just need to expand your sampling frame. And that's the idea behind this is the bigger your sampling frame, working with quality providers should give you a better, more representative sample in the end than if you stick only with your own. So that's the theory behind it. Obviously it's challenging, but that's the goal.
I have a follow-up question, but I want to tell the audience, please do not hesitate putting your questions either in the chat or the Q&A. The follow-up question is, when you do that, can you check that the same, we know that some people are on 3, 4, 5 panel, so can you check that you don't have the same people in the different sources?
Yes, when you work with partners that you have proper guidelines, agreements in place, quality controls, there are ways to make sure that it's not the same individuals. Obviously, there are some very basic ones with email addresses, but aside from this, IP address checks, there are many different levels of quality controls, but I'm not going to dive too deep into this because I'm not the experts in all the barriers that we can put on this, but it's part of our requirements working with the various suppliers that we are able to make those checks. We are able to make sure that this doesn't happen because indeed it's important.
Okay. I can ask another question. when you speak about your gradient, okay, in fact, if I understand well, you conclude that the best mix would have been to have like 70% telephone and 30% online to have a good evaluation, but you don't do that, of course, and this mostly for financial reasons.
Well, one thing is that we've done this exercise very recently, so it's knowledge we did not have in the past because we've looked at this from a different lens. I can't really speak to what's going to happen moving forward with this, but it's certainly an important finding. I'm not the one that decides on everything we do at the national level for our polling, so I can't answer for our team on that. But it's something that now looking at the results, we found that this would have worked better in this way. Is it something that we're going to do moving forward. I assume we'll certainly look at it again, but I don't know. But your point about cost is an important one. It's much more expensive to do a full caddy representative sample, especially with all the challenges in landline versus cell coverage now. So it is much more expensive. It's more time consuming, and it depends not just on us, but on partners who want to work with us.
Okay, I have a final question, and I still wait, people, if you have questions, don't be shy. Do you do you think that what's going to happen is that firms will move to probability panel and this in most parts of the world? Like I see that we don't have it in Canada, if I understand well. But do you think is this a goal to move to probability panels?
I don't know if it's a goal, but yes, we think it's going to move in that direction. We think it will. I know in the UK, it has become a requirement by a lot of public sector government bodies are starting to really require that if you do online research, it needs to be probabilistic in nature. We know in the United States, a lot of partners, media partners, considered that when in previous years we did opt-in online research, they didn't want to treat it the same way as if we did probabilistic online research. And moving into the knowledge panel after we purchased the knowledge panel, that also alleviated some of the concerns for them. And we do think it will become more and more common across markets, which is why we're right now we are expanding it across multiple markets in Europe. I don't have the whole list in front of me, but we are doing so. And personally, I hope we're going to move ahead with something like this in Canada, because I think it's a good, sound approach. It's a better way of dealing with research when you require those types of samples. But opt-in online panels remain extremely useful for most of what we do. And now we're talking a lot about political polling, voting intentions, very specific needs for representativeness. For a lot of other private sector research we do, it's not as important. And if you responses vary by 2 or 3 points, doesn't matter as much compared to really finding, if you work on branding or marketing, it's not the same needs at all. So opt-in panel is a better option because it's faster, it's cheaper. But for this in the future, I personally, I hope we're going to do it, but I don't know. We'll see, because it depends on who wants to pay for it. Because as you can imagine, providing people with internet access and a device to answer online is not cheap. It's not easy to do, and it requires very different panel management over time, because we have to provide a very different level of client service. We need to accompany those people because often they will also come from more vulnerable backgrounds. So there are a lot of additional layers of complexities and extra work and investments that are needed to do it properly. So that's why it's not as popular as maybe we would want it to be.
I have 2 last questions, perhaps last. Yes, I would think so. But we're open. You, Michel Ernstali says, you say that web surveys are much cheaper than CATI. What about the knowledge panel? Is it still much cheaper, or a bit cheaper, or not cheaper at all?
It's not as expensive as Caddy, but it's certainly so it's in between. But from one country to the next, the whether it's closer to Caddy or closer to online varies a bit, because it depends on the panel recruitment method that will be used. In certain countries, you don't have access to a complete, very detailed mail listing, for example. So doing the mail-based approach is not as accurate and it's not as good. So you need to either complement quite broadly with CADI and RDD, or you need to do, in some countries, you can only do it through RDD recruitment. So that changes your upfront costs quite a bit. So in those cases, then the end result is you tend to be almost as expensive as CADI. So it's somewhere in between, but it moves around a little bit from country to country depending on the recruitment challenges and some of the maintenance costs, because they won't be the same, because internet access not the same cost. The devices will not be also will not have the same cost across different countries. So there's no simple answer, but it's somewhere in between will be my answer. In general, a little bit closer to the CADI side, but not very close. So it's cheaper, and it's certainly faster than CADI once it's recruited. So that's another big advantage.
I have a question from an anonymous attendee. The question is addressing desirability bias the only or the most important advantage of using mixed mode, or what are the other advantages that it provides? It's a general question.
And my answer might be a bit boring, because I think it would depend on which countries we talk about. In certain countries where sampling is the biggest challenge, where getting a representative sample is a bigger challenge, then maybe mixed mode is more important to alleviate the sampling challenges. And so your intervention has the biggest impact in terms of non-response bias or sampling coverage bias. In countries where reaching the proper sample is not as challenging and you do have more representative samples to start with, then yes, social desirability, removing the social desirability bias would become the biggest benefit. So I would say it changes from one jurisdiction to the next, but the idea is really that it's supposed to act on both. That's the theory.
The same attendee asked, do you believe that mixed mode can protect electoral surveys from being increasingly questioned by far right electorate? And far left, I would say.
Yeah, the extremes are the ones, and it comes back to deeply political divided electorates is where we obviously have the biggest challenges with our sampling in general. That's a very tough question, and I would say we don't have a clear answer on that yet. We are starting to use the knowledge panel for political polling. Are we able, for example, to properly reach some silent Trump voters in the United States using the knowledge panel? I don't know. My inclination would be to say that maybe not. And I see now on screen the Serbian Progressive Party or different countries. So in many different countries, some of the divides are very different. It's a good question, because the reluctance to engage with anything that is official institutions or polling institutions, to what extent would the knowledge panel change that? It's not clear. Someone who's really reluctant to engage with any type of questioning about their political beliefs is probably not that much more likely to respond to a mail letter they get at home from a polling institute as if they get a phone call. So I don't think it would make a big difference, but again, I don't know. I don't have a real good solid answer on that. Over time, it might help. That being said, if obviously the more accurate we are and the more people trust that this is done properly, over time, we would want this to help. But as we know, dealing with political division and misinformation is extremely difficult.
Sébastien, I will give you the the last question, in fact, it will be only, I guess, a small opinion for you. Dr. Dallaire recommended moving from the art of survey to a more rigorous science when using mixed mode. Does this refer to limitation in the academic research or practitioners with limited knowledge? What does he suggest we do to make this happen?
I wouldn't put it that way. I certainly don't think it's because of any lack of knowledge in academic. There's tons of academic research on data quality, measurement quality, the impacts of different modes, and so I certainly wouldn't say it's a lack of academic understanding of those issues. When I say we want to introduce a more scientific approach, is that local expertise and knowledge is extremely important, and it's important. Like, we cannot improvise ourselves to be good pollsters across different countries without having a sound, solid basis in each of those countries. But we also don't want to strictly rely on our instincts or knowledge of the past to try to predict where we should go, and to try to have a sense of whether the snapshot we're taking on any given week on sampling is likely to stick for the next week or whatever. But obviously the snapshot is what we measure today. Like, we're measuring what's happening today or what happened in the past. We don't know what's going to happen in 5 days, but how can we make sure that the measure for that day is the most accurate possible? It will always be a mix of science and local knowledge, or what we call the art of polling. It's never going to be, at least I don't think, entirely one or the other, but it's important that we don't rely so much on just individuals' instinct about a market, because that's not the best way to move forward.
Okay, we had the last question from Carmen, but I'm afraid we have no time. And Carmen, I think part of your question is has been answered at the beginning by Sébastien. And this is the time where I can remind you, everybody, that wait a minute, everything is recorded. And slides will be available also on WAPOR's website. This will happen very soon. You will also receive a questionnaire on your experience, and my publicity webinar is sponsored by World Association for Public Opinion Research, free for all the community. So the next, I have it here. I think the next webinar will be on data collection with wearables, apps, and sensors. So bye, everybody. Thanks for attending. And it was a pleasure, Sébastien. It was really a pleasure to have you. So we see you again for the next month for a presentation by Florian Koch. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.